Thank you very much for those kind words. Right. This year's International Symposium on Cultural Diplomacy in the Commonwealth falls in the summer when we mark the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War and the establishment of the United Nations. As my invitation to the symposium stated, these events were two of the major transitions that have taken place in the development of human rights, moving us towards a more peaceful, prosperous, equal and protected society. Together at this symposium, we mark these historic occasions and the global cooperation that has followed. Today I'll try and explore the potential impacts on global cooperation that could be experienced by the UK's European Union in-out referendum due to take place before the end of 2016 and the role of the UK Foreign Office in a time of much international cooperation. First, I wanted to make a few comments on the origins of cultural diplomacy as we know it today. It was after the Second World War that triggered the major powers to come together to promote international peace and cooperation. In San Francisco in 1945, the Charter was signed to found the UN. Of course, the UN itself was foreshadowed by the League of Nations, created at the end of the First World War by the Treaty of Versailles in order to promote international cooperation and to achieve peace and security. Despite the League of Nations' failure to prevent the Second World War, the appetite for international cooperation had been generated and the United Nations followed. Just 4 years later, in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known more as NATO, was also founded. Whilst today we think of NATO as a defensive nuclear alliance, originally it had three-pronged purposes: to deter Soviet expansion, to forbid the revival of nationalist militarism in Europe through a strong North American presence on the continent, and to encourage European political integration. All of these encourage international diplomacy, which we're here today to discuss. In the years since these organizations were created, international cooperation at the UN Security Council and NATO has in many ways displaced the need for each country to have such an active Foreign Office. The UK Foreign Office has three main purposes: the safeguarding of UK's national security, building prosperity by increasing exports and investment, and supporting British nationals around the world. Firstly, I would now argue this is done through international cooperation and organisations such as the UN, NATO, and the G7. So displacement is taking place in the sense just mentioned. The Foreign Office do support national security, but the primary decisions are made on an international level. With regard to the second, promoting British business, whilst the Foreign Office have the contacts to do so at a governmental level, I don't believe they have the ability to do this at a sub-government level. There are also issues about what makes a company British. Is it the shareholders, the jobs it provides, or the geographical location of its headquarters? Increasingly, in the global world we live in, it's hard to see how taxpayers' money should be invested in assisting the marketing efforts of multi-billion-pound transnational firms. This communication between transnational firms is another example of international cultural diplomacy, taking place neither at national or international level, but in a private capacity. Trade agreements, however, are of course a different story and do need governments to talk to one another. Of course, supporting British nationals and dealing with immigration and emigration is still an important role that must be fulfilled, and this is a key part of the Foreign Office brief. So international cultural diplomacy has grown on both a public and a private level by international bodies. However, it's vital that we recognise the continued importance of national bodies when dealing with foreign policy. The single biggest foreign policy question in the UK at the moment is our membership of the European Union. In 2013, 2 years before the general election, David Cameron said, if a Conservative government was elected, we would offer a referendum on EU membership. In the face of opinion polls predicting minority governments or coalitions, my party surprised many by winning the general election in May with 36.9% of the vote and 330 seats in the House of Commons. The Conservatives are now going to deliver on our manifesto promise for an EU referendum before the end of 2016. It was in 1973, when Ted Heath was Prime Minister, a Conservative with a fantastic war record, but a desire to prevent future conflict, that Britain first entered into the European Economic Community, a precursor to the EU. 2 years later, in 1975, Britain voted by 67.2% to 37.8% to stay in the EEC under renegotiated terms of entry. I was 8 years old during the referendum, the last time that took place on our membership of Europe. I remember my brother and I were given a long string of stickers that said, "Say yes to Europe." Being young lads, we stuck them to everything we possibly could. And it was only later we discovered quite how difficult it is to get rid of orange pro-European stickers. Concern about the EU has been growing in the UK for a number of years. This growing concern is clearly demonstrated by the founding of the UK Independence Party, UKIP, in the 1990s. Their primary purpose was to seek the UK's withdrawal from the EU. More recently, in 2014, the European elections indicated the scale of the British public's concern about the UK's relationship with the EU. In the UK, the anti-EU party UKIP came first, with 27.5% of the vote. Labour was second, with 25.4%, ahead of the Conservatives with 23.9%. Indeed, across Europe at the 2014 elections, there was an increase in the number of seats held by Eurosceptic parties, although pro-European groups were still in the majority. The UK's mantra has become the notion of creating ever closer political union. We in the Conservative Party have long been concerned by this idea. As I discussed earlier, international bodies have a vital role for achieving international diplomacy, but national bodies are key too. Our concern over this increasingly closer international political union has led us to give the British people a choice on the future of the European Union. This has been called an in-out referendum or a yes-no referendum, but the choice is far more complex than the question allows. This referendum should not be viewed as an attempt to break up a partnership. It is instead a choice between closer political union within Europe or a free trade and common market agreement. Even if the British public vote to leave the European Union, we would still be friendly towards Europe and we would still trade with Europe. My colleagues and I recognise how important the EU is to our economy, although figures from the House of Commons Library show that the EU accounting for 45% of our exports and 53% of our imports last year. The UK exported £227 billion worth of goods and services to the other EU member states and imported $288 billion. That's compared with exports to the US of $90 billion and exports to China of $17 billion. It's also claimed that about 3 million UK jobs are dependent on the EU. However, the Treasury explained that the 3.3 million figure to Open Europe, saying that it was not an estimate, but the impact of EU membership on employment, and therefore this is because we would trade with the EU would continue if the EU and the UK were to part company. But strong cultural and diplomatic bonds between the UK and Europe would not be severed by a no vote in the referendum. Our shared history, many years of cooperation, and back and forth migration would remain were the UK to vote to leave the EU. So from this we can see international cultural diplomacy is vital for our economy, which an international body is key for. However, it is not only for an international body, as one overarching body cannot always represent the interests of all of its citizens, as defined in the Lisbon Treaty, and this is where national governments come in too. I have found that each of us concerned about the EU has our own specific concerns about it and how we would like to see it changed. I represent part of the county of Herefordshire, the home of cider in the UK. The county produces over half the cider in the UK, approximately 63 million gallons per year, and it's home to famous brands such as Weston's and Bulmers. At the last count, there were more than 9,500 acres of cider orchards across the county, and it's reported that the area grows by more than 600 acres each year. Then in March this year, it became clear that the European Commission was pressurising the UK government to scrap the tax exemption for small-scale producers of cider and perry who make less than 70 hectolitres a year, an exemption that was helping my constituents start up in cider making. I was assured the government would make strong representations to the Commission about that ruling, and this is just one instance, as an example, of EU interference in UK politics and decision-making in a way not favourable to their citizens, again as defined in the Lisbon Treaty. Many of my colleagues in the House of Commons have their own ideas about how to reform the European Union and to make it work for us. The Prime Minister rather helpfully set out his proposals of reform in March 2014 in what was called the Bloomberg speech. He spoke about powers flowing away from Brussels, not always towards it. National parliaments being able to work together to block unwanted EU legislation, businesses being liberated from red tape, UK police forces and justice systems being able to protect British citizens without interference from the European institutions, and free movement to take up work, not free benefits, and removing the concept of ever closer political union. The key challenge for Britain is to strike the key balance on free trade to gain the economic benefits of participating in a trade bloc and the benefits of national diplomacy. Beyond international trading, the EU has had an impact on Britain's international links with non-EU states, like those in the Commonwealth. Although the House of Commons Library, according to the House of Commons Library, trade between China and India has more than doubled since 2006. The EU could be said to be hindering our trade with Commonwealth countries. I understand that even outside the EU, the structure and orientation of the UK economy would be likely to place important constraints on our capacity to reorientate trade in the medium term. It's morally important that we maintain links with the Commonwealth following the breakup of the British Empire in the early 20th century to ensure their economies are supported. It appears to me the EU has less interest in pursuing free trade agreements with those Commonwealth countries than the UK does. At 9.5%, the UK's export share to the Commonwealth is greater than, for instance, France, 5.7%, or Germany, 5%. The EU has preferential trading agreements with 16 of the 53 other Commonwealth members, covering around a third of the UK's total Commonwealth exports. The EU is in negotiations with a further 26 Commonwealth members, covering an additional 45% of the UK's total Commonwealth exports. Notable exceptions include Australia and Pakistan. The EU has also thus failed to secure any preferential trade agreements with Brazil, India, or China. A key question of the UK's referendum on EU membership will be whether the UK's trading strength would be greater outside the EU than inside. Whilst it may be easier to conclude deals alone rather than as a group, the smaller size of the UK market may mean other countries give higher priority to deals with the EU than the UK. The House of Commons Library has suggested UK interests may be poorly represented in EU trade negotiations in areas of service market access, since the UK has comparative advantage in cross-border trade, services of language, time zone, and structural features of the UK economy. As I have explained, the EU referendum will impact on diplomacy at state level and at business level. On a cultural level, though, one does not need a trade agreement or agreements between separate governments to remember a shared history or to share values. Regardless of the result of the referendum, the many positive effects of immigration from Europe over the decades cannot be altered, nor can our position geographically. Whether the UK and the EU is linked by a trade agreement or a more binding union whose goals is ever closer political unity, these fundamentals cannot be altered. This element is a key part of international cultural diplomacy. International relations go beyond the economies and policies of countries to the culture that people share. Going to the broader question now of the UN, this body is key in fighting the global terrorists that we are faced with today. Despite many organisations encouraging peace and diplomacy, we still have many problems to tackle. In Africa, we have Boko Haram, and in Syria, we have ISIL. The United Nations have encouraged the relevant African states to work together to tackle Boko Haram, and the African Union have also supported this aim. The response is being led by the Lake Chad Basin Commission and Benin. However, in June, the Nigerian president met with the G7, asking for additional help and support in their fight against Boko Haram. I am concerned with how to strengthen the UN Security Council to meet its needs. I believe this concern was shared by the UK government. Conflict prevention is one of the UK's priorities for its presidency of the UN Security Council in August 2014. On the 21st of August 2014, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 2171 on conflict prevention. This expressed the Security Council's resolution to, and I quote, enhance the effectiveness of the United Nations in preventing and ending armed conflict, their escalation, spread when they occur, and their resurgence once they end. It's only by a united effort that we can defeat these threats. To conclude, today I've attempted to explore several themes in the spirit of international cooperation as we celebrate 70 years of working with countries from across the world through the UN. International cultural diplomacy exists in a public capacity, internationally with bodies like the UN seeking global justice and prosperity, and nationally with national governments, but also in a private capacity through transnational dealings in large multinational corporations and through private trading between national companies. All these support international relations, key to ensuring international cultural diplomacy in different respects. One cannot take on the role of another. This, in fact, is the cornerstone of the EU referendum debate. To what extent can the EU properly and democratically represent its citizens from all different member states, and at what point should power be delegated to national governments using the notion of subsidiarity enshrined in the EU treaty itself? To ensure this balance is achieved, the Prime Minister needs to renegotiate our deal with the EU before the UK government can put the referendum to the people. Once renegotiation has been concluded, the referendum will be put to the British public, so there are many debates yet to come on the EU membership for the UK. When the campaigns commence, I would like those to be positive on both sides. I'm optimistic that the campaign and the debate can be centred on visions of better futures. Those on each side should argue by explaining why life should be better if we stayed in or why it would be better if we left. Whatever the result, I'm confident the UK will have a strong relationship with Europe, and we will work globally towards a more peaceful, prosperous, equal and protected society, using international bodies like the UN, NATO and the Commonwealth to support us. More than that, we will do this within our relationships every day in our multicultural society. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Thank you. What?
Right. Well, there's quite a lot in that very quick question, I think. The challenge I throw back, if you like, is that if you want to integrate fully and properly into the European Union, then you also ought to want to adopt the euro. Because my perception is that as the European euro users, which is the majority, those states will do everything they can, particularly in light of what's been going on in Greece, to support the euro. That will lead to a desire for fiscal unity, equality of taxation as well. And if we see that, countries outside the euro, such as the UK, will be at a disadvantage. So I don't see how, particularly the Labour Party, can go on saying we'll never join the euro, but we want to stay in the EU, and we're very happy to see closer, ever closer political union. You can't be both. Either you join and you open-armed, enthusiastic embrace of the whole deal, or you step back and say, no, we will be your friends, but we are not going to be part of the United States of Europe. And I think that is where we have to decide. Personally, I'm not in favour of being part of the United States of Europe. I think that is a concept, particularly in France, that's caused by an envy of what's achieved in America. And if you look at what the Americans do with their GDP, they spend 20% of their GDP supporting the poorer areas by taking money from the richer ones. And that is what we have seen fail with the Germans supporting the Greeks. And you can understand why the situation is as it is through German and Greek eyes. But if you don't support the weaker areas from the stronger areas, then you cannot have a United States. So our model to compete with America is failing already. And what we should do is recognize where the strengths are and build on that, rather than try to dragoon people into being part of a United States of Europe that they really don't want to be part of.
Excellent. Second, Israel, and I believe, of course, we're going to lose our sovereignty if we.
Well, that's another question. Yeah, absolutely.
The second question, please. Yes. Introduce yourself.
Okay. The answer is no. It's very straightforward. The sovereignty of your country is a matter for you, and I would be as unhappy if the Pakistani government was telling us to change our education system so that we have 3 tiers. The important point, though, that I think you need to address, as we all do, culturally and diplomatically, is you will never stop the cleverest people achieving the most. In fact, it's really helpful that they do. What you mustn't do is hold them back through a class system. So it's not the class system that is the enemy. The enemy is the ability to move within it. Social mobility is what we call it in this country. So it doesn't matter where you're born. It matters what you do with your life and how much you can achieve, and that your achievements should not be held back by your background. And in fairness, we see both in Britain. David Cameron and I were in the same class at the same school, very elitist if you like. But I haven't become Prime Minister, more's the pity. But so it doesn't matter. The important thing is that it isn't a prerequisite to be a Member of Parliament to have gone to Eton. It isn't. There are plenty of colleagues here who've come from all sorts of different backgrounds. The flexibility is the key, and it's that social mobility. And you pick your education system, but whatever system you pick will fail if you do not have social mobility.
But you have the equal opportunities here. Unfortunately, we don't have the equal opportunities over there.
So it's your social mobility. It's your social mobility that's the problem, not your education system.
We have 2 tiers. Yes. The last question we take from our friend, please.
As many as you like. I don't want. I'm here all day.
My name is Kate.
Well, I would caution you, because if you look at the situation in Greece, I'm not sure that the EU is an ideal role model. If you want a single country, choose America as a better example. But I don't think, or indeed the United Kingdom. But the honest truth is that we spend a lot of money in Scotland and in Wales through the Barnett formula, over and above the money that we spend in England, because you must be able to distribute the wealth so that you don't have the German-Greek situation that the EU has got. And if that situation does not get better, you will see the Greek people move to a cash-only economy where they have struggled to provide the healthcare their people need, and they will be in real trouble. And therefore, don't base your future on a model that can allow that to occur. And that's why my people in this country have got grave reservations about wanting to remain in the EU. Because ultimately, the people that know best are the people closest to whatever the situation is. So devolving power away from the centre is a much better model than taking it all to the middle. And particularly when you've got language differences and genuine diversity of cultures as you've got in West Africa. Unifying for economic benefit is worth it, but for cultural and diplomatic ones, you're better off on your own.
Sir, thank you.